Analyzing the U.S. tariff implementation on China 2024, for key phases and a $1.2 billion cost impact on e-commerce platforms. Comprehensive summary. In 2024, the anticipated implementation of U.S. tariffs on China is expected to unfold through four critical phases, significantly affecting both China's economy and U.S. e-commerce platforms, with a projected cost impact of $1.2 billion. This analysis of the tariff situation reveals three primary scenarios: baseline, upside, and downside, each forecasting distinct economic repercussions. Phase 1, Baseline Scenario. The baseline scenario anticipates a 20 percentage point increase in the effective tariff rate on Chinese exports to the U.S., likely resulting in a 0.6 percentage point reduction in China's GDP between 2025 and 2027. This scenario assumes the effective weighted average tariff rate WATR on Chinese goods will escalate from 10.3% in 2023 to approximately 30% by 2027. Primarily due to tariffs linked to fentanyl smuggling disputes. The expected outcomes include a 20% decline in Chinese exports to the U.S., with substantial effects predicted for 2026. In response, the Chinese government is expected to implement fiscal stimulus measures totaling RMB 4.1 trillion annually, aimed at cushioning the economic blow. Phase 2, Upside Scenario. In a more optimistic upside scenario, the effective WATR is projected to increase by only 10 percentage points over the same period. This outcome could result from constructive bilateral negotiations, effective lobbying from businesses, and domestic inflation concerns, leading to a milder impact on China's economy. Under this scenario, direct U.S. imports from China would drop by approximately 10 percentage points, resulting in a GDP drag of about 0.3 percentage points. Phase 3, Downside Scenario. Conversely, the downside scenario forecasts a dramatic increase in tariffs, potentially reaching up to 60%. This scenario reflects a significant deterioration in U.S.-China relations, resulting in an effective WATR increase of 40 percentage points. The consequences would be severe, with predictions of a 40% decline in Chinese exports and a GDP contraction of 2.5 percentage points over the same timeline unless substantial stimulus measures are enacted. Common points across sources. All analyses agree on the crucial role of tariff elasticity, how responsive U.S. consumers and businesses are to changes in tariff rates, which is expected to increase over time. Furthermore, it is emphasized that the Chinese government is likely to focus on non-tariff retaliatory measures rather than a direct tit-for-tat approach, due to the constraints posed by its trade surplus with the U.S. and the potential harm to its own economy. Differences between sources. While the EIU source provides a detailed macroeconomic analysis and scenarios, other sources such as the Tax Foundation focus on broader implications of tariffs on U.S. fiscal policy and trade dynamics, highlighting the political context surrounding tariffs and their potential impacts on domestic industries. Timeline of events. 2023, the effective WATR on Chinese goods stands at 10.3%. January 2025, newly imposed tariffs related to fentanyl smuggling disputes take effect, marking the beginning of the first phase of tariff increases. Late 2025, additional tariffs are phased in under the incoming Trump administration, contributing to the potential rise in effective WATR up to 30%. 2025 to 2027, the economic consequences of tariffs start to manifest through reduced GDP growth and export declines, with stimulus measures introduced by China in response. In summary, the anticipated U.S. tariffs on China in 2024 are set to unfold through various scenarios, with substantial implications for both economies, particularly impacting trade dynamics and e-commerce platforms, ultimately costing the latter an estimated $1.2 billion. The situation remains fluid, with potential for both cooperation and conflict in U.S.-China trade relations. Detailed analysis of scenarios. Scenario 1, Baseline Impact. The baseline scenario indicates an increase in tariffs that would significantly affect the dynamics of trade between the U.S. and China. A 20% rise in tariffs is expected to cause a 20% reduction in exports, which would be felt mainly in 2026. The Chinese economy, while initially resilient thanks to front-loading of exports, will begin to experience notable declines in growth prospects as the effects of the tariffs set in. The anticipated GDP contraction of 0.6 percentage points from 2025 to 2027 implies serious ramifications for employment, consumer confidence, and investment. The Chinese government's proposed stimulus of RMB 4.1 trillion, while substantial, may only partially offset the economic downturn. As such, the economic landscape in China would shift towards increased reliance on domestic consumption and investment, potentially leading to structural changes in the economic model. Scenario 2: Optimistic upside scenario. The upside scenario offers a more favorable outlook with only a 10 percentage point increase in tariffs. In this scenario, the effects on the Chinese economy would be significantly less severe. A 10% drop in imports would reduce GDP by 0.3 percentage points, indicating that the economy could absorb the tariffs due to stronger domestic policies and resilient supply chains that redirect trade flows. This scenario highlights the importance of bilateral negotiations and business lobbying, which could mitigate some of the tariff impacts. The economic resilience in 2025, projected at 4.8% growth, reflects effective policy measures and a favorable external environment that could cushion the blow from tariffs. Scenario 3: Severe downside scenario. The downside scenario presents a stark warning. With a 60% tariff threat leading to an effective WATR increase of 40 percentage points. Such a drastic escalation would result in a 40% decline in exports, leading to severe economic repercussions, including a 2.5 percentage point GDP contraction. In this context, the Chinese government would be compelled to implement more aggressive stimulus measures, raising fiscal expenditures to RMB 6.9 trillion annually to mitigate the impacts. The anticipated depreciation of the renminbi would further complicate the situation, leading to potential inflationary pressures domestically. Conclusion: the impending U.S. tariffs on China in 2024 represent a critical inflection point in trade relations between the two nations. The analysis of the scenarios underscores the complexity and potential volatility of the economic landscape, with significant implications for both countries' GDP, trade dynamics, and the global economy. As the situation evolves, the response from both the US and China will be pivotal. The potential for negotiation remains, but the underlying tensions and economic repercussions will shape the future of US-China trade relations and the global economic framework. E-commerce platforms in particular are poised to experience substantial cost impacts, making adaptability and strategic planning crucial for businesses operating in this environment. The analysis of U.S. tariff implementation on China in 2024 uncovers several counterintuitive insights regarding economic responses and the nature of retaliatory measures. Here are some key points. 1. Tariff elasticity and consumer behavior. The expected increase in tariff elasticity is counterintuitive. Initially, trade is described as inelastic, meaning that consumers and businesses are slow to adjust their purchasing habits in response to tariff increases. However, as time passes and consumers identify substitutes for Chinese goods, the elasticity is projected to increase significantly. This suggests that while initial impacts may seem limited, the longer-term effects could lead to substantial declines in imports from China as consumers shift their preferences. The notion that consumer responsiveness to tariffs is low at first but increases over time challenges the assumption that immediate impacts are fully representative of longer-term adjustments in behavior. 2. China's non-tariff retaliation. A notable counterintuitive aspect of China's response to U.S. tariffs is its likely focus on non-tariff retaliatory measures rather than direct tariff increases. This is surprising given typical expectations of tit-for-tat strategies in trade wars. The analysis indicates that due to the trade surplus with the U.S., China may find itself in a position where retaliating with tariffs could harm its own economy more than it would damage the U.S. This leads to a scenario where China may utilize measures such as anti-dumping investigations, export controls, and substitution of U.S. goods rather than imposing reciprocal tariffs, which could undermine the expected escalation of trade tensions. 3. Impact of currency stability. Another counterintuitive insight is the Chinese government's commitment to maintaining currency stability despite the pressures of a depreciating renminbi. While one might expect China to aggressively devalue its currency to boost exports in the face of tariffs, the analysis suggests that the government is more concerned about overall economic stability and will intervene to prevent excessive depreciation. This indicates a prioritization of long-term economic health over short-term gains from cheaper exports, which contrasts with typical expectations in trade conflict scenarios. 4. Stimulus measures. The extent and nature of China's fiscal stimulus in response to tariffs can also appear counterintuitive. While one might assume that any economic downturn due to tariffs would lead to aggressive fiscal policies, the analysis suggests a nuanced approach where stimulus measures are substantial but must also consider the long-term sustainability of public finances. The projected RMB 4.1 trillion annual stimulus in the baseline scenario, 3.2% of nominal GDP, highlights a significant intervention, yet the overall economic growth rates are still expected to decline due to the impact of tariffs, indicating that even substantial stimulus may not fully counteract the adverse effects of external shocks. 5. Expectations of bilateral negotiation outcomes. The likelihood of successful negotiations leading to tariff reductions is assessed as low, which might seem pessimistic. However, the analysis notes that ongoing tensions and deep-seated disagreements between the U.S. and China may render meaningful progress in negotiations unlikely. This contrasts with more optimistic views that suggest that economic interdependence would ultimately drive both parties toward compromise. The expectation that political and public sentiments will inhibit negotiation success emphasizes the complexities of international trade relations that are often oversimplified in popular discourse. In summary, the analysis of U.S. tariffs on China in 2024 reveals several counterintuitive dynamics. The shifts in tariff elasticity may lead to significant long-term changes in trade patterns. China's strategic focus on non-tariff measures rather than reciprocal tariffs, a commitment to currency stability despite economic pressures, and a nuanced approach to fiscal stimulus all contribute to a complex and multifaceted economic landscape that defies straightforward predictions. The report on the implementation of U.S. tariffs on China in 2024 outlines a complex interplay of economic scenarios and their implications for both nations. While the main points regarding GDP impacts, tariff rates, and potential government responses are highlighted, several critical aspects may be overlooked in broader discussions. Here are some of those significant yet frequently underappreciated elements along with their importance. 1. Tariff elasticity and long-term trade behavior. The report emphasizes tariff elasticity, the responsiveness of U.S. consumers and businesses to changes in tariff rates, as a pivotal factor in determining the overall economic impact. The increasing elasticity over time suggests that as tariffs are imposed, U.S. buyers will become more adept at finding substitutes for Chinese goods, leading to a sharper decline in import volumes than initially expected. Significance: this aspect can drastically alter initial projections of U.S. import values from China. Businesses might experience a rapid shift in consumer behavior that could lead to profound long-term changes in supply chains, impacting not only trade balances but also employment and investment decisions. Companies that do not anticipate these shifts may face significant financial repercussions. 2. Non-tariff retaliatory measures by China. The report suggests that China is likely to implement non-tariff measures rather than engage in direct reciprocal tariffs. This includes potentially targeting U.S. firms through regulatory scrutiny, expanding export controls, and promoting substitutes for U.S. products. Significance: non-tariff measures can be more insidious and harder to predict than straightforward tariffs. They can create barriers that stifle U.S. companies' access to the Chinese market without the clear-cut impact of tariffs. Understanding this strategic shift is vital for U.S. businesses aiming to maintain or grow their presence in China, as it may necessitate different approaches to compliance and market engagement. 3. The role of e-commerce platforms. The report notes a projected $1.2 billion cost impact on U.S. e-commerce platforms due to tariffs, but does not delve deeply into how these platforms will adapt to or mitigate these costs. Significance: e-commerce platforms are critical in the globalization of trade, and their response to tariff impacts can shape consumer access to goods and ultimately influence market dynamics. Strategies such as sourcing alternatives, adjusting pricing structures, or enhancing logistic efficiencies could be significant. Overlooking how these platforms will adapt may lead to a misunderstanding of the broader market impacts. 4. Political dynamics and their influence on trade policies. The report alludes to the political context surrounding tariff implementation, particularly the influence of the incoming Trump administration. However, it does not fully explore how political sentiments could shift, affecting long-term trade policies. Significance: political motivations can drive trade decisions significantly. The potential for changing political landscapes, such as shifts in public opinion regarding tariffs or international relations, could lead to abrupt policy changes, complicating business planning and cross-border strategies. Companies need to stay attuned to these dynamics to navigate the uncertain terrain effectively. 5. The impact of currency fluctuations. While the report discusses potential depreciation of the renminbi and its implications for trade, the nuanced effects on investment, inflation, and purchasing power are less emphasized. Significance: currency fluctuations can have cascading effects on trade, including altering competitive advantages in global markets. A depreciating currency may make Chinese goods cheaper for U.S. consumers, potentially offsetting some tariff impacts. Conversely, it can increase the cost of imported inputs for Chinese manufacturers, affecting their pricing strategies and profit margins. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for businesses on both sides of the trade. 6. Broader economic context and global supply chains. The report focuses primarily on the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China, but does not sufficiently address the implications for third-party countries and global supply chains. Significance: the interconnectedness of global trade means that changes in tariffs and trade policies can have ripple effects across various economies. Countries that are part of the supply chain may experience shifts in investment and trade flows, which can lead to broader economic implications. Businesses must consider not just U.S.-China dynamics, but also how these changes affect their operations and supply chains globally. 7. Historical context of trade policies. The analysis is rooted in recent tariff actions but does not delve deeply into the historical context of U.S.-China trade relations and previous cycles of tariffs. Significance: historical precedents can inform expectations about future trade negotiations and the likelihood of resolution or escalation. Understanding past behaviors can provide insights into how both governments might react under pressure, helping stakeholders to anticipate outcomes more accurately. In conclusion, while the report provides a solid foundation for understanding the impending U.S. tariffs on China and their immediate economic repercussions, the overlooked aspects such as tariff elasticity, non-tariff measures, e-commerce impacts, political dynamics, currency fluctuations, global supply chain effects, and historical context offer a deeper understanding of the complexities involved. These nuances are critical for businesses, policymakers, and scholars who seek to navigate the evolving landscape of international trade. 1. Economic scenarios and their implications. The analysis outlines 3 distinct economic scenarios, baseline, upside, and downside, each with varying impacts on China's GDP due to the proposed increase in tariffs. The baseline scenario predicts a 20 percentage point increase in the effective weighted average tariff rate WATR on Chinese exports, leading to a 0.6 percentage point reduction in China's GDP from 2025 to 2027. In contrast, the upside scenario forecasts a more modest increase of 10 percentage points, resulting in a GDP drag of only 0.3 percentage points. The downside scenario, however, anticipates a drastic increase of up to 60%, potentially contracting GDP by 2.5 percentage points. This analysis underscores the critical importance of tariff elasticity and trade dynamics, as the scenarios illustrate varying levels of vulnerability for the Chinese economy, which could inform strategic responses from policymakers. 2. Impact on U.S. e-commerce platforms. The projected cost impact of $1.2 billion on U.S. e-commerce platforms is a significant point of concern. This figure reflects the anticipated adjustments that e-commerce companies must make in response to tariff increases, which could include rising costs of goods, changes in supply chain logistics, and potential shifts in consumer purchasing behavior. The analysis suggests that e-commerce businesses may face higher prices and reduced demand, impacting their profitability and market strategies. This point invites deeper discussion regarding how these platforms can adapt, innovate, and potentially leverage technology to mitigate the adverse effects of tariffs on their operations. 3. Retaliatory measures and political context. The analysis notes that while the Chinese government is expected to respond to U.S. tariffs, it may not resort to traditional tit-for-tat tariffs given its trade surplus with the U.S. Instead, China may implement non-tariff retaliatory measures. This strategic approach indicates a shift in how countries might engage in trade disputes, focusing on more nuanced economic tactics rather than straightforward retaliatory tariffs. The political context surrounding these tariffs, including potential negotiation dynamics under the incoming Trump administration, further complicates the trade landscape. This aspect raises questions about the effectiveness of tariffs in achieving political objectives and the broader implications for international relations. For fiscal stimulus as a response to tariff impacts, the analysis highlights the expected fiscal stimulus measures that the Chinese government may implement in response to the economic fallout from tariffs. In the baseline scenario, China is projected to introduce stimulus measures amounting to RMB 4.1 trillion annually. The potential for fiscal expansion and monetary easing indicates that policymakers are aware of the need to bolster the economy against external shocks. This point opens up discussions on how effective such stimulus measures can be in stabilizing economic growth, the trade-offs involved, and the potential long-term effects on China's economic structure and consumer sentiment. These 4 points provide a foundation for in-depth analysis and discussion regarding the upcoming U.S. tariff implementation on China and its multifaceted implications for both economies. 1. Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act 1930. This legislation raised U.S. tariffs on hundreds of imports, aiming to protect American industries during the Great Depression. However, it led to retaliatory tariffs from other countries, significantly reducing international trade and worsening the economic downturn. The act is often cited as an example of how protectionist policies can exacerbate economic crises. 2. U.S.-China Trade War 2018-2020. Initiated by the Trump administration, this series of tariff impositions targeted Chinese goods, with the U.S. increasing tariffs to as high as 25%. In retaliation, China imposed its own tariffs on American goods. The trade war disrupted supply chains, affected consumer prices, and led to significant economic uncertainty for both nations, mirroring the potential impacts of the tariffs discussed for 2024. 3. The Tariff of 1828. Tariff of Abominations. This tariff was designed to protect northern industries by imposing high duties on imported goods. It incited widespread discontent in the southern states, who felt economically oppressed by the tariffs. The backlash contributed to the nullification crisis, highlighting how tariff policies can lead to regional tensions and political strife within a nation. Future outlook. Predictions for U.S. tariff implementation on China 2024. As the U.S. prepares to implement significant tariffs on Chinese goods in 2024, the economic landscape for both nations and global trade is poised for transformative changes. Based on current analyses and forecasts, we can delineate 4 key phases of impact alongside a strategic exploration of potential outcomes across 3 scenarios: baseline, upside, and downside. The ramifications are expected to profoundly affect China's economy and U.S. e-commerce platforms, with an estimated $1.2 billion cost impact for the latter. Phase 1, Baseline Scenario, 20% Probability. In the baseline scenario, the effective weighted average tariff rate WATR on Chinese exports to the U.S. is anticipated to rise from 10.3% in 2023 to approximately 30% by 2027. This increase is largely attributed to tariffs stemming from fentanyl smuggling disputes. The immediate impact is projected to result in a 20% reduction in Chinese exports to the U.S., with the most significant effects manifesting in 2026. Economically, this scenario predicts a contraction of China's GDP by about 0.6 percentage points between 2025 and 2027. The Chinese government is expected to respond with fiscal stimulus measures approximating RMB 4.1 trillion annually to mitigate adverse effects. Key predictions: GDP impact, minus 0.6% reduction over 2025 to 2027. Exports, 20% decline in Chinese exports to the U.S. Fiscal measures, RMB 4.1 trillion in stimulus annually. Phase 2, Upside Scenario, 15% Probability. The upside scenario presents a more optimistic outlook, where the increase in the effective WATR is limited to 10 percentage points. This scenario is plausible if constructive bilateral negotiations occur, coupled with effective lobbying from businesses and domestic inflation pressures that curtail aggressive tariff hikes. Here, the direct impact on U.S. imports from China would be a 10% decline, resulting in a GDP drag of approximately 0.3 percentage points. Key predictions: GDP impact, minus 0.3% reduction over 2025 to 2027. Exports, 10% decline in U.S. imports from China. Fiscal measures, RMB 2.9 trillion in stimulus annually. GDP growth, expected to remain robust at 4.8% in 2025. Phase 3, Downside Scenario, 25% Probability. The downside scenario anticipates a drastic escalation of tariffs, potentially reaching 60%. This situation would arise from a significant deterioration in U.S.-China relations, leading to a substantial increase in the effective WATR by 40 percentage points. The economic ramifications would be severe, with a projected 40% decline in Chinese exports to the U.S. and a GDP contraction of approximately 2.5 percentage points over the same period, unless substantial stimulus measures are enacted. Key predictions: GDP impact, minus 2.5% reduction over 2025 to 2027. Exports, 40% decline in Chinese exports. Fiscal measures, RMB 6.9 trillion in stimulus annually. Currency impact, possible depreciation to RMB 8, US dollar 1. Commonalities and divergences across predictions. Across different analyses, a consensus emerges regarding the significance of tariff elasticity, how responsive U.S. consumers and businesses are to changes in tariff rates. This elasticity is expected to increase over time, suggesting a growing sensitivity to pricing shifts due to tariffs. Additionally, it is widely recognized that China is likely to employ non-tariff retaliatory measures rather than a direct tit-for-tat approach, particularly given its trade surplus with the U.S. and the potential self-harm of such actions. However, differences exist in how various sources contextualize the impacts. For instance, while macroeconomic analyses focus on broad GDP impacts and trade dynamics, some studies emphasize the political nuances influencing tariff implementations and their repercussions on domestic industries. Timeline of key events. 2023, effective WATR on Chinese goods stands at 10.3%. January 2025, new tariffs related to fentanyl smuggling disputes commence. Late 2025, additional tariffs are phased in under the incoming Trump administration. 2025 to 2027, economic impacts materialized characterized by reduced GDP growth and export declines alongside stimulus measures introduced by China. Conclusion. The impending U.S. tariffs on China are set to unfold through various scenarios, each with significant implications for both economies. As the global trade environment becomes increasingly complex, the interplay between tariffs and trade dynamics will shape the future of U.S.-China relations and the broader e-commerce landscape. Businesses on both sides must remain agile, adapting to evolving policies and market conditions to navigate the anticipated changes effectively. The situation is fluid, with the potential for both cooperation and conflict in future trade relations.